Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Millard Fillmore, and the focus is Congress and family. The year is 1841, it's March, and Fillmore is beginning his fourth term as a member of the U.S. House of Representatives, and things are looking good because his Whig party is in the ascendancy. For the first time, a Whig had just been inaugurated as President of the United States. That's William Henry Harrison, and the Whigs had captured both houses of Congress. So this was going to be an opportunity, perhaps finally, to really push forward with legislation that supported Henry Clay's so-called American system. In this system that he had been advocating for quite some time included a lot of federally funded internal improvements, roads, bridges, canals across the country. Also, high protective tariff, the distribution of excess funds from the federal land sales back to the states, and possibly even a return of the Bank of the United States. Well, Millard Fillmore wanted to play a prominent role. In fact, he put his sights on the top rung in the House to run for Speaker of the House, one of the most powerful positions in all of the federal government. And he ran a credible race in the House. It came down to two people, him and John White of Kentucky. White became Speaker. Fillmore finished second in the internal balloting within the House, but this made him really ready for a prime assignment as a committee chair, and he ended up getting the most important committee chair spot as chair of House Ways and Means. House Ways and Means would have responsibility over pretty much the entire domestic economy as far as legislation was concerned. This was the heart of the Whig platform, and so he was in a great spot. And then it all fell apart. It fell apart when Whig President William Henry Harrison died 1 month into office and was replaced by his Vice President John Tyler, who ran on the Whig ticket, but he was really always a lifelong Democrat. And from his political ideology, around which he was pretty intransigent, he was not very flexible. He was really going to stick to his Democratic roots, and he started vetoing legislation that the Whigs were putting forward, initially principally focused on the Bank of the United States. This was not going well for the Whigs in Congress, who were kind of at their wits' ends. In fact, at the end of the first session of Congress, they formally kicked Tyler out of the party. Tyler's entire cabinet, except Daniel Webster as Secretary of State, they resigned. They basically said, look, we came here to work for a Whig. You're not a Whig. We're leaving. This was a really tough spot for Whigs in Congress because their entire agenda seemed to be thwarted by this president. Well, Fillmore and some of the Whigs in Congress thought they might have one area that they could move forward on, and this was the protective tariff that they were advocating. The tariff had been a pretty serious controversial issue, a sectional issue primarily between the North and South for decades. This was the principal means by which the federal government got its money. There was no income tax at the time. The tax on imports through the tariff was the principal way that they got funding to actually pay the federal government's bills. But there were two schools of thought. In the South primarily, they wanted revenue-only tariff. And by this they meant keep the rates low, and bring in just enough revenue to be able to pay the federal government's bills, no less but no more. In the North, they wanted a protective tariff. This was the manufacturing center of the country, and they wanted to be able to have better competitive advantage over international finished goods that were coming into the United States. If you put a higher tariff on them, they would be more expensive for the domestic consumption, and domestic consumers would be more likely to buy the goods that were being manufactured in the domestic market in the North. So they wanted a protective tariff, raise those rates, not just to raise revenue to pay the government's bills, but also to protect the domestic manufacturing industry, very much of a sectional divide. Well, the Whigs had typically been pushing for those high protective tariffs, and that's where Millard Fillmore stood. He thought this was appropriate. In fact, he said, sad experience is fast teaching us the folly of granting favors to foreign nations, which they are unwilling to reciprocate. Protective industry is the wealth of the nation. Foster that, and you are prosperous and happy. That's where Millard Fillmore stood. But John Tyler was not aligned. His Democratic roots, his Southern roots, were pretty much against high tariffs. And he had a particular focal point. The nullification crisis in 1832 was a fight over the tariff, what was called the Tariff of Abominations by the South. And South Carolina in 32 had actually nullified that federal law, and it was actually a force of arms that was potentially going to have to solve this dispute. Eventually, John Tyler became part of that solution, a negotiated solution in the Congress to gradually reduce the rates to a point that was acceptable to the South, pretty much capping them at 20%. Nothing would be higher than that. And Tyler considered those caps as unbreachable. They were sacrosanct because he had a lot of sweat equity into getting that compromise in place. The Whigs had one lever that they potentially could play to try to get Tyler on board, and he indicated he might be if this trade-off was put into place. If the Whigs were willing to take off the table the distribution of those funds from federal land sales back to the states, which was just going to drain the federal coffers, if they would take that off the table, Tyler might be open to the higher tariffs because he wanted to get more revenue into the federal government. The country still wasn't doing all that well economically. The Panic of 1837 was still carrying forward. This was a tough time, and Tyler was not going to raise the tariff and have those federal funds go back to the states from the land sales. That combination was never going to work for him. Now, the Whigs wanted their cake and eat it too. They sent up a couple of bills that would do just that. Just the protective tariff with no mention of the suspension of the payments to the states from the land sales. And of course, Tyler vetoed both of them. But Fillmore took the leadership to actually try to drive through a compromise in House Ways and Means. And eventually at the end of this session, he put forward a bill that did raise the tariff rates. In fact, in some cases, more than double, 40-50% for some particular items. But they did agree to suspend the distribution of sales from those land sales back to the states, and this was something that John Tyler ultimately agreed to. He signed the Tariff of 1842. In fact, sometimes it had been called the Fillmore Tariff. He was really principally responsible for it in the Congress. This was a rare legislative achievement for the Tyler administration and for Congress during this tenure. The North was certainly thrilled by this. They got the protection they were looking for, and even the South was willing to go along given the state of the economy. How did Millard Fillmore celebrate this great triumph? He decided to retire from Congress. Tyler's presidency did not bode well for the Whigs. This was not going to be a good election coming up in Congress, and Fillmore had been in a place of prominence, chair of House Ways and Means. The last thing he wanted was sort of a demotion into the minority because he was expecting the Whigs to lose the majority, and so he decided, you know what, after 4 terms, I'm going to go home. He said, "My utmost ambition has been satisfied. I aspire to nothing more and shall retire from the exciting scenes of political strife to the quiet enjoyments of my own family and fireside." And that's exactly what he did. Now, before he left, he had one other duty that was kind of interesting, in that he got behind an inventor. He got behind an appropriation of $30,000 for Samuel Morse. Morse had shown him a prototype of his new telecommunications tool called the telegraph that he was inventing. This was as early as 1838. And Fillmore was enamored with this. He thought this could really be revolutionary. In fact, he said it was made of lightning, a messenger of intelligence which annihilated time and space. It brings all nations to so near together that they can, as it were, hear each other speak. Fillmore became convinced that here was an invention that was destined to aid in the civilization and progress of the world, which was very true. It needed some support, and he thought Congress should get involved, and he helped support the $30,000, which was to build a prototype telegraph between Baltimore and Washington, D.C. That got up and running, and in short order, Morse's telegraph did indeed change communications, not only in the United States, but around the world. For the last decade or so, Fillmore spent a lot of his time in Washington, D.C. This was away from family and friends, but he maintained close relationships with those folks, primarily through letters, including his children. And these were really interesting letters. They were caring, they were insightful, they were full of encouragement across the full spectrum of life's topics. Just a couple of examples. This is one from a letter that he wrote to his son, Powers, 1842, when Powers was 15 years old, focusing on education and character. Millard Fillmore told his son that after all, it is the man who has a constitution to endure an untiring energy of character that rules our world. Mere literature and indolence are nothing. They make a man contemptible. But when united with talents, industry, and perseverance, they make the statesman, the general, and the leading men of the world. To his daughter, who again he was also very supportive of, daughter Abby, he wrote, "I shall be very happy to do anything for you that I can to give you a perfect education and adorn you with every grace that the best teachers and the best society can confer. For I love my daughter very much and am very anxious to gratify her in everything that is proper, presuming that she will ask for nothing else. That last part, interesting. He was not overly indulgent, but incredibly supportive. These were not the stern taskmaster that, frankly, some other presidents were in their letters to their children. They were both lighthearted. They did talk on serious topics as well, philosophy and life, but mostly a steady stream of encouragement and counsel in these voluminous letters to his children. Well, he's ready for his change, and he's going to get a lot more FaceTime with those family and friends because he was on his way back to Buffalo. Or his political career, not at an end though, just in a point of inflection. That'll lead to stories for another day. That is Millard Fillmore and Congress and Family from the life of Millard Fillmore. For more presidential chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.